So, this is going to be a meaty one, and I know that this could go down like a lead balloon with some people purely because, um, it's not that it isn't just, it is. It's against bigotry. It's about human dignity, about human voices. But for some out there, this is going to be the equivalent of me openly worshipping Satan during a Catholic Mass. It's going to be perceived as that level of heresy. So, yeah. With that caveat out of the way, and I make no apologies for it, I say it with a degree of concern, shall we say, for the reaction. But I'm reminded that what is said when those of us who are minorities are facing injustice, and that is to speak even when your voice and your whole body trembles. And so that's what I'm going to do. People are going to be looking at the title, and if I were to sum up the why behind it in one word, it would be Marxism. Now, people need to understand how feminism, how racial, how movements addressing racism, how intersectionality has evolved in the context of Marxism. Now, I just want to explain Marxism a little bit to begin with, just as a starter course. Some people will be familiar with this, some won't. So, classical Marxism argues that basically all of society has two classes: the bourgeoisie up here and the proletariat down here. And the argument is that the bourgeoisie, who are the capitalist class, basically exist, their entire wealth, their privilege, if you will, um, exists by exploiting the proletariat or the worker class. There are issues with things being myopic in that. When you look at risk, for example, anyone who's owned a small business knows that when the business is bad, for example, your employers get paid while you starve, generally speaking, in nations that have good good workplace safety laws, good worker rights, etc. Things like award wages, etc. Things like that. Now, what happened was, and Aaron Pitsey has made a note of this in various interviews that you'll find along the way. Um, Gender Marxism, which is basically second wave and onwards, but there's arguably elements of this in the Declaration of Sentiments at Seneca Falls, back with the start of first wave feminism anyway, but I digress. What she noted was that around the 1950s, I think it was, around the end of the 1950s, women on the left, as she describes it and what she really means, are Marxists on the left, wanted their own female-centric movement as distinct from Marxist men on the left. And so what you had was a movement that was addressing women's inequality through a Marxist lens. In other words, women facing inequality automatically makes them the proletariat down here. And then because they're looking at it through the lens of sexism, where men appear to be benefiting, things are a lot more complicated than that, and I can go through it in another video. Men are perceived as the bourgeoisie up here. And so everything is seen through the lens of male oppression of females. And by the way, if you have a problem with me using females in that context, you must equally have a problem with me using the word males, because it is the exact same thing. And for just in case anyone wants to engage in cancel culture, sexism, misogyny, etc. No, it's not. If I'm using males and I'm using females together, there is no problem with that whatsoever. And if you only have a problem with one and not the other, you're a hypocrite. I digress. So when it comes to things like abuse, etc., you have a model which is only capable of seeing abuse through the lens of male power and female oppression. And I'll come back to that. Then, of course, you have things like, for example, the development of critical race theory. Critical race theory, you need to understand, has happened through a very Western lens, a very white lens. If you look at slavery, traditionally, we have had black on black slavery, we've had white on white slavery. As someone pointed out, the name Slav for the Slavic peoples actually meant slave traditionally. You've had the Berber slave trade, where you've got slave trade in Libya. All different races have enslaved all different other races, be it black on black, white on white, black, black on white, white on black, etc. But of course, from a Western perspective and our recent history, we mainly look at things through white on black racism. And so critical race theory, again, put people of color here as proletariat and white people here as the bourgeoisie. Had that developed, say, in Africa, had it developed in, say, China or Japan, etc., it could have just as easily placed, basically black people here in the bourgeoisie category, or Asians in the bourgeoisie category here, and all other races, including white people, here, because all races are racist in some way. But of course, critical race theory, again, argues from the perspective of white privilege, because it's looking at largely white racism towards other races. And so then, of course, you have the gay rights movement, again, becoming Marxist, and where you have persecution of LGBT, or even just LGB we'll focus on at this point. Individuals, again, it becomes LGB individuals here, and of course, straight people here. Then you have trans, intersectional people as well. And obviously, okay, yes, queer with LGB and all sexual orientation parts of the LGBTIQ+ obviously apply to what I was talking about there, where you have straight privilege, again, and the notion of straight oppression of LGB and everyone else in that community where it's a sexual orientation issue. Then you move on to trans situations, and again, transphobia, etc. You get things like, for example, you have cisgendered people here. You have transgender, intersectional, etc. here. And so what you wind up with is this whole thing of intersectionality. And intersectionality is basically a Marxist approach which tries to reconcile itself with everything. The problem is that as much as these groups scream Nazi, when it comes to people with a disability, they are that very thing. And they are that very thing because they cannot reconcile ableism. They cannot reconcile disability discrimination, because to do so completely turns their entire dogmatic, and it is a very dogmatic approach. It turns that entire paradigm on its head. It's like walking into a fundamentalist Christian church or an Orthodox Jewish synagogue, or walking into a fundamentalist Islamic mosque and going, here's ironclad definitive scientific proof God does not exist. As you can imagine, people would absolutely lose their minds. And that's what you're dealing with here. The reality is, if you look here in Australia, for example, we know back from when Graham Innes was removed as the Disability Discrimination Commissioner, because the position was liquidated, the only discrimination position that was liquidated, rates of disability discrimination cases heard before the Australian Human Rights Council were roughly equal to the combined number of cases of sex discrimination and race discrimination. As a yardstick, that presents a good argument that disability discrimination here, and I would imagine by extension elsewhere, is basically as bad as sexism and racism combined. Yet, let's look at how these groups are capable of dealing with things. You have, for example, people with a disability who are abused by female abusers, female perpetrators. And it does happen. It happens with child abuse. It happens with domestic violence. It happens with rape. It happens with pedophilia. It does happen. Yet, going back to what I was saying about patriarchal dominance models or patriarchal theory, that feminist theory of female oppression by male oppressors applied to abuse. The only party capable of, in female on male abuse of people with a disability, the only party capable of possessing male power and matching the description of men can only be perpetrators is the victim. The only party capable of matching the description of women can only be victims and experiencing the oppression of women is the abuser. On top of that, people with a disability have no real power. The stats and the horrors that are coming out through the Disability Royal Commission, the ways I've been treated, the ways other people with disabilities have been treated, and what I went through compared to some of that was a picnic. But again, when it's a female perpetrator, the only way that when you add up all those value judgments that I brought up about patriarchal dominance models, the only way they can reconcile cases of female on male abuse against people with a disability is by arguing that the victim's mere existence oppressed their abusers into abusing them. And to challenge that, the reason you get hit with arguments of you just want to harm women, etc., and all of this, is because according to their cult-like religious beliefs, anyone who challenges patriarchal dominance models must be providing cover for the oppression of women in the form of violence. And so this is literally the only way they're capable of thinking. And so they're literally, to maintain their dogma, they literally have to treat people with a disability, like myself, who have been abused by female perpetrators, like useless eaters. That's literally what that amounts to when you're arguing that someone's mere existence is so oppressive that it warrants violence and abuse against them. Then you're literally making the useless eaters arguments of the Nazis, and you're literally contributing to attitudes which created the very culture of the Nazi euthanasia program. That wonderful thing that had people with disabilities sterilized through laws that would later go on to sterilize Jews. That wonderful genocide that resulted in the creation of the gas chambers that would later go on to mass murder 5.8 million Jews. And yes, Cyclone B was refined in the concentration camps, but the gas chambers themselves were developed in the research hospitals. That's a matter of historical fact. And so this is what feminism is literally pushing. They talk about punch a Nazi, but when it comes to female and male abuse against people with disabilities, their position is literally the position of a Nazi. And it's dogmatically bound. And getting these ideologues to change that is like turning around and making a devout follower of an Abrahamic faith renounce the existence of God. That's what you're up against. And then you have things like critical race theory. Well, according to critical race theory, people who are white, and especially white males, when you start getting into intersectionality, when you fully get into it, cishet white males, the pinnacle of that, which I match the description of, but I am also on the ADD and autism spectrum. I have been abused for most of my life, and anyone objectively looking at what I've been through would in no way, shape, or form call me privileged. Yes, other bigotries can create additional boundaries, but the fourth circle of hell doesn't become heaven just because the seventh circle of hell is worse. It doesn't work like that. Reality doesn't work like that, and anyone looking at this with empathy can see that. But these ideologues don't have empathy because their dogma prevents them from having empathy. It's atrophied them. The response to these ideologues is, to howl down people with a disability who are white and male who speak out about what it's like to be a victim of female-perpetrated abuse in the system being re-victimized with, "You're a white guy! You're a white guy!" Why? Because they can't see the realities of disability. Because in their mind, you're a super bourgeoisie, you're white and you're male, you've got double privilege. And so therefore there's no way you could be an oppressed minority. Again, as I said, it's like expecting someone who is deeply religious to renounce their faith with fervor. It's not going to happen. And then, of course, you've got, and you especially see it when you've got people saying, even in disability circles, I get you're angry if you have a disability, but if you're a white male, you'll never be as far behind as a female. Or, as I've been told elsewhere, disabled white males cannot be oppressed because disabled white males benefit from misogyny and whiteness in ways that disabled women of color do not. That's what you're dealing with, this insanity. And if you want to look at a case of where that just goes out the window, a few years ago in the ACT here in Australia, and there have been numerous cases like this, it was uncovered that a 10-year-old white boy on the spectrum had been locked in a cage that had been specially built for him by his teachers, and this was on the principal's okay. And it was a female principal that was doing it. Now, my challenge to all these people, all these ideologues, and I'm hesitant to call them people because the reality is when you dehumanize others and have so little empathy, you really are a monster at that point. Not permanently, not intrinsically, but by choice, and as of that time, you are a monster, an actual monster. My challenge to these ideologues is to tell me how a 10-year-old autistic child being locked in a cage is just white male privilege backfiring, or how being white and male somehow made such an horrific trauma somehow trivial or lesser. Honestly, tell me how that's possible without sounding like an absolute monster and everything you claim to hate. I'll wait. Yet this is exactly what you see, and BLM are just as bad. Two examples with BLM. Despite the fact that disability discrimination in this country is so bad, we've got a Royal Commission, which, by the way, for our US listeners, is essentially the equivalent of either a grand jury or a presidential commission. That's how serious the problem is here. Despite that, you have BLM activists openly shaming people for using the hashtag Disabled Lives Matter because it takes away supposedly from Black Lives Matter, even though the plight of people with a disability makes racism look like a relative picnic in comparison. Or when you have these people, these ideologues, pushing hashtags like disability too white, where apparently disabled white people have too much of a voice, when disabled white males are treated like perpetrators when they reach out for support, and have their abuse treated like white male privilege backfiring. I mean, could you imagine the reverse happening with race? Could you imagine these people, these ideologues, putting up with someone turning around and saying, with, say, a hashtag of advocacy too black? Could you imagine the outcry over that? Could you imagine the outcry from BLM in the US if someone turned around and said, don't you dare use Black Lives Matter, because ableism is far worse than racism, and when you use Black Lives Matter as a hashtag, you're diminishing the hashtag of Disabled Lives Matter? Could you imagine the outcry? And rightly so, because when it comes to injustice, we shouldn't be throwing anyone under a bus. Yet that's exactly what we're dealing with, whether you're talking about SJWs, whether you're talking about feminists, whether you're talking about Black Lives Matter. All of these Marxist organizations, all of them refuse to recognize ableism because it brings their Marxist ideology collapsing down like a house of cards the moment they do. The fact of the matter is that when you are forced to admit that ableism is an even bigger problem in our society than racism and sexism. And I'm not saying racism and sexism aren't serious problems. They absolutely are. As is homophobia, as is transphobia. And there are ableist elements in that too that need to be addressed that I would address in another video, but society's too ableist to even begin to do that at the moment. Sometime down the track, I probably will, but not now. But the reality is that when these people are forced to admit, these ideologues, that ableism is such a severe problem that their intersectional matrix, and when I say matrix, I don't mean the movie, I mean the mathematical construct, an array, basically, is another way to describe it. When they discover that disability discrimination completely collapses their intersectional array like a house of cards, it's like saying to someone who's religious that God doesn't exist. And unfortunately, these individuals, these ideologues, are not rational individuals. They are dogmatic individuals. They are best compared to religious fundamentalists. And when it comes to ableism, they are guilty of being the very Nazis they want to punch. Now, I could get angry at that, and I have in the past. But I'm starting to realize that what Nelson Mandela said about racists, about the racists who imprisoned him, was right. When you hate people, you give them your heart. And the fact of the matter is, these monsters that view me like an uppity retard and an uppity spastic, and I don't care if those words are offensive to you, because the reality is that's how we're treated, regardless of whether people use that word. The reality is that these people, in the way they treat us the way they do, the way they silence us, the way they mock us, the way they diminish us, the way they threaten us, the way they malign us and libel and slander us as predators because we dare say that disabled lives matter, all of those things make them the very Nazis that they want to punch. There's a great line in The Dark Knight. You either die young as the hero, or you live long enough to see yourself become the villain. I have no doubt that these ideologues, in many cases, have the best of intentions. But the road to hell is paved with good intentions. And the reality is that when it comes to helping people with a disability, ending that bigotry, which is every bit as serious as racism and sexism, and arguably even more so, especially when the world has learned nothing from the way that ableism was used to make the final solution a reality. The reality is that these people who are ideologues, these people, no matter what their intentions are, they are part of the very problem that they claim to want to solve, because you do not deal with injustice by turning injustice into a zero-sum game. You deal with injustice by recognizing the humanity of people and operating off the premise that all lives matter, all voices matter, all people deserve dignity. And that doesn't diminish from any group. Because the moment you do that, you are saying that voices of all different races matter, that the lives of all different races matter, the voices of all genders matter, and the lives of all genders matter. You're saying that everyone, regardless of their sexual orientation, matters and their voices matters. You're saying that everyone, regardless of their sexual orientation, matters and their voices matter. You're saying that everyone, regardless of whether they're disabled or able-bodied, matters and their voices matters, their lives matter. You're setting a standard, saying all human beings deserve dignity, all human beings deserve respect, all human beings deserve their barriers and their traumas to be recognized and mitigated. All human beings deserve to be the best they can be, regardless of race, regardless of gender, regardless of sex, regardless of disability, and regardless of their sexual or gender orientation. And anything else I might have missed, for anyone goes you missed that, we'll consider it an inclusion by omission, if that happens. And my apologies if I did, not intentional, and the point I'm making is should make that abundantly clear. So ask yourself, do all lives matter in your life? Do all voices matter in your life? Or does your ideology matter? Until next time, folks, Be kind to each other. You deserve it. And so do the people around you.